Yeah, just so in case you wonder, my background is
Ah,
Zhangjiajie. I don't know if you heard about that place. It's really nice. It's where this movie Avatar supposedly was
oh,
inspired, with a very
right, okay.
straight up and down kind of mountain.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's another spot on your list.
It certainly is. It looks astonishing.
Yeah,
It looks like an inspiration for some Chinese landscape paintings that
yeah.
I love. By the way, I haven't discussed this, and maybe I have, but I love Chinese landscape paintings. And when I went to Shanghai, I made sure that I bought lots of prints of Chinese landscape paintings, and they're all over my house. So when you do eventually come to London, I can show them to you.
Yeah. And Chinese painting, like you said, I think at one point that it's also very reflective of the Chinese culture, very calm,
Yeah,
very peaceful, right? Kind of
yeah.
not
Mm,
very dramatic, in terms of both the color, everything. Very different from
mm.
the European
Oh, it's
painting.
completely different.
Yeah.
It is profoundly different. And I'm not the only person to have noticed this. One of Catherine's teachers, who is a man called J.H. Prynne, who is perhaps Britain's leading poet, but he's also a professor in Cambridge. Anyway, he loves Chinese paintings precisely for that reason,
Hmm.
and learnt Chinese and writes Chinese poems. It writes poetry in Chinese and gives lectures to his English literature students about Chinese painting, for example.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm not the only person to have made that observation.
Yeah.
Mm.
It's very interesting. Okay. Let's start with China. There's so much to cover there, right?
Today, this has been an astonishing week. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's
Mm.
start with Janet Yellen's visit.
Mm.
Overall, is it fair to say she achieved nothing? Is that your impression?
Yes. Overall, to answer your question in one word, yes, I think it was. But I'm going to make before we actually talk about Janet Yellen.
Uh-huh.
I think the most important thing to say is that over the last week, and I suspect to an ever greater extent from now on, Beijing has established itself as the world capital of diplomacy. So we
Hmm.
have Yellen there. We're going to have Blinken going to Beijing. We have Olaf Scholz and a big, very strong German delegation coming. American business people, of course, also meeting Xi Jinping. We have Lavrov. I think
Hmm.
he's just left
Yeah,
Beijing. And of course, we have Putin coming fairly soon.
in
And of
May.
course, we have all kinds of other people. May, I think, yes, that's the what I've heard. So, Beijing today is the world center of diplomacy, which is, of course, the first time that has happened since the 18th century. That
Yeah, yeah.
the capital of world diplomacy is not a European or a Western one, and that is a momentous fact, and it's one that we should notice and hold on to. But let's turn to Yellen's visit because it's a very interesting visit actually. And
Yeah.
the first thing I have to say is that it shows you the complete disconnection between the American and Western propaganda narrative about China's economic situation and the reality. So we hear all the time about China is in stagnation, it's in crisis. I've sent you articles in which the word crisis is used. We've had these horrible American credit rating agencies, knock down China's credit rating, which I mean, it's one of those ludicrous things on planet Earth, country that runs massive trade surplus, has enormous financial reserves, the world's biggest industries. You're actually going to start taking down its credit rating. Why? I mean, there are things that if you look at them objectively, they make no sense. Of course, if you look at them politically, and remember that these so called international credit agencies are actually American credit agencies, they make total sense. And China isn't bothered because, of course, it has its own credit agencies, which are the ones that I think more and more of the world before long is going to start following. But anyway, well, we have that narrative, China's economic crisis. And then we have Yellen. And she comes and she says China has this enormous overcapacity. Its industries are far too strong. They're far too modern. We have Mrs. Tai, who is the Commerce Secretary, saying that we aren't careful, the Chinese will swamp us with all their tremendous products, and their economic model is it's unbelievably unfair because it's more efficient and successful than our own. So we have all of this. So I mean, either China is in crisis or it's too successful and it's going to conquer and take over everyone. Now, what Yellen really came to do in Beijing, I think there were probably three things.
Mm-hmm.
Firstly, I think the Americans, at least the Biden administration, wants a stable situation with China in the run-up to the presidential election in November. They do not want a crisis. And I've been reading some very interesting articles in Global Times, which, like many non-Chinese people, is the Chinese newspaper that I tend to go to first, mentioning about the fact that the United States is now in a trap in Ukraine and in the Middle East. You can't risk a conflict with China over Taiwan and the South China Sea. By the way, that very same point to me has been made several times by none other than Professor John Mearsheimer.
Yeah, I saw you guys talking about this.
Yeah,
Yes. Yeah.
absolutely. And, he's made that point several times, and the Chinese media is now openly talking about it, at least the part of the Chinese media that is addressed to outsiders, and it is of course true. So the Americans want to avoid a major crisis with China at this time, though they're not prepared to make any substantive concessions. They want the Chinese to agree to just keep things stable, even as the Americans continue to do all their horrid things. And at the same time, they don't want things to get completely out of control. So that's one. The second thing they want to do is that they want to keep the economic show in the United States on the road up to November. And they're worried about their debt problems. They understand that there's a bubble in the stock markets now festering around AI. They are piling on debt, $1 trillion of it every 3 months. So again, they don't want the situation economically with China to become unstable. And lastly, and not least, they know that there is a big, difficult situation for themselves in Ukraine. The Russians are winning. There is nothing the United States can do to reverse that. The Europeans are getting restless. Some of them are coming up with reckless ideas, like the French, about sending troops to Ukraine, which could be a potential catastrophe for the United States. So what do? You've got all of these three problems. So you go to Beijing, you call Xi Jinping, you send Yellen and then eventually Blinken to Beijing. Also, you try and keep the economic situation stable. You try to get the Chinese to, not do things in the global economy that lose more jobs in the United States, affect where American industries. The Americans have suddenly realized that the Chinese are ahead of them in green technologies and in AI technology and in all of those things, where the Americans, until a year or so ago, thought they were the world leaders. So they don't want anything there. And they also want China's help to get themselves out of the mess they got themselves into in Ukraine. And they've convinced themselves, with some cause, that the reason the Russians are winning is because China has Russia's back in a kind of sense. They want the Chinese to slow down on buying oil from the Russians, and they want the Chinese to buy less gas from the Russians, and they want the Chinese to send fewer machine tools and chips and things like that to the Russians. And so they've come basically begging. But of course, the Americans find that very difficult to do. So they're incredibly arrogant at the same time. They can't resist making threats. And it's these contradictory signals. Now, the Chinese do what they always do in these situations. They don't shut the door. They let Yellen come. They're very polite, very courteous to her, just as Xi Jinping was with Biden. But if you drill through,
Mhm.
they are completely firm on everything. There is no movement. And why should they be? Because I think China realizes that the Chinese leadership understands the true situation in its economy perfectly well. They know that there's no crisis, that growth is strong, that manufacturing is becoming stronger, that China is building up a big lead in technologies. I saw the how many robots China installs in its factories every year, and compared with the US, I mean, China's up there, the US is really down there. I mean, again, the difference is staggering. So the Chinese feel confident. They're confident that they have the Americans diplomatically in a corner over Ukraine as well. But they do that which they always do. They say to the Americans, look, we're prepared to listen. We want a stable relationship also. We don't want things to get out of control. We're not going to take advantage of you. We're not going to, you know, take over Taiwan, impose a no sea zone or no fly zone over the South China Sea. That's not what we are about at all. But if you actually want a real improvement in our relationship, then you have to understand that you have to change your policies. You have to change your approach to us and indeed generally, and start behaving in a more realistic way, which is more in keeping with your actual capabilities. And that is what the Chinese have been saying to the Americans in meeting after meeting after meeting, basically from the last years of Barack Obama's administration.
Yeah, that's I mean, one thing that you said really correct is that the contradictory behavior, right? So
Mm,
everybody can see that clearly Biden called Xi Jinping, basically ask for help and push to
mm,
get Yellen to come to China, and then later Blinken.
mm,
Almost like immediately after he's off the phone, Yellen was on the plane, right? So
mm,
so it's kind of almost like an urgent situation. At the same time, I mean, Yellen came here, like you said, ask all these kind of things, over capacity. Okay, she wants the word they use is bolster financial stability, which is Chinese media interpret that as buying more, treasure bonds,
yeah.
and slowing down your trade with Russia, blah blah, right? So it seems like there is a lot of demand they want from China, and yet at the same time, these are the things they're doing. So just about the same time that Yellen is in China, the U.S. announced that it's planning to deploy medium-range missile systems in Asia Pacific. It
Mm,
hasn't set the date, but saying before the year end. Okay.
mm,
The other thing is a Biden official, I mean, openly put pressure on the Dutch government to tell ASML to stop serving the lithography machine that they sold to China. They openly called that. And then the other thing is they did is the US, Australia, Philippines, and Japan had a joint military drill in the South China Sea. Now that thing became some kind of a debacle because I think they planned to do it in 3 days and a really big scale. Eventually, I mean, what China said is, okay, we are not going to do a counter drill. This time, we will be combat ready. They use the
mm,
word combat ready.
mm,
And once that's said, so that whole thing become, okay, one day, very rushed, just a few ships showed up and not even the most advanced.
mm,
It's kind of like old ships. And then they quickly concluded in the day.
mm,
So it's
mm.
another debacle. But you see, all these things they're doing is to provoke China, to irritate China. At the same time, they ask so much things they want China to do. How can that, anybody in their right mind believe that can work?
Well, this is the Americans. I would add to that list, by the way, the visit of Prime Minister Kishida of Japan to the United States.
Yeah.
And, he's going to make a joint address to Congress. But if you read the Anglo-American media, it's all about strengthening the alliance between Japan and the United States against China. So, I mean, you want China's help, but you are forging an ever tighter relationship with Japan, which has had, as we all know, within recent memory, certainly the recent memory for the Chinese people, whose historic memory is the longest of all, within recent memory, did terrible things to China, and yet the United States is getting close to Japan, in spite of all of that. Well, I agree. I mean, any orthodox, conventional approach to diplomacy would not act in this kind of way. I mean, that is not how diplomacy is conducted. Certainly, it is not how diplomacy is conducted towards China. I have an observation, which I regularly make on my programs, by the way, which is that there are two laws that anybody who understands international relations should always follow. Rule one, don't march on Moscow. Don't send your troops towards Moscow. Rule two is don't bluff Beijing. Because if you bluff Beijing, your bluff will always be called. And that's what the Americans do. They are addicted to playing poker. They want things from China, but they think that they can be incredibly threatening to the Chinese at the same time. And that will somehow scare the Chinese and cause them to back down. Now, against nearly every other country that the Americans do this to, until very recently, it worked. It used to work with the Russians, by the way. I mean, even during the Cold War, as I remember, the Russians often made concessions because they were nervous at what the Americans might do. With China, that never works. The Russians tried it in the 50s and 60s, and it failed then. And that was against a much weaker China than the one we have today. It is not going to work now. It is not going to work ever. But the Americans don't know anything else. They've never negotiated with any other country on an equal basis. That is something that is really outside their imagination. And they continue to hold on to this terrible idea, which Blinken especially talks on about incessantly, and which you hear in all sorts of White House statements, that we will cooperate with China on issues which are advantageous to us, but we will be competitive with China on all other matters. And they seem to think that saying that is somehow clever, when of course it unties the entire relationship. You cannot conduct foreign policy, diplomacy with a country like China on that, but with China specifically on that basis.
Well, I think the way they do it is like Biden in particular. On the surface, he likes to pretend that he understands this, that he cannot bully China. Because just on the phone call, just they had, a week ago, last time when we talked, he just had that phone call. So in this phone call, here's what he said. In the readout, it says President Biden reiterated that United States does not seek a Cold War. Its objective is not to change the China system. Its alliances are not targeted against China. The U.S. does not support the Taiwan independence, and the U.S. does not seek a conflict with China. And U.S. support follows one China policy, and the U.S. does not want to curtail China's development and does not seek decoupling from China. You see, all these things sounds very reasonable, but what they do, what the United States does, is the exact opposite, isn't it?
Correct. Absolutely. That is exactly correct. And this is, Biden talking in this way, he is, of course, ignoring a warning that Xi Jinping gave to him about, I think it was about a year and a half ago now, during another, actually, it wasn't a telephone conversation, it was an actual, virtual meeting, in which Xi Jinping said to him, look, you tell me one thing, and then your administration goes away and does the opposite. And in effect, as I've mentioned many times, Xi Jinping was basically telling Biden, please stop lying to me. And yet Biden goes on doing it. Now, after our program last week, I read the readout, the English language version of the readout, which has been published by the Foreign Ministry. And I got to say that I thought it was the firmest readout that I have seen from the Chinese from Xi Jinping towards Biden, towards the United States. Now, the Chinese always very careful, Xi Jinping always very careful to explain things, spell them out very, very carefully to the Americans. But this time, I have to say, I noticed, a sort of steel coming in. I mean, it was tougher, I thought. I mean, well, not tougher, firmer than it has ever been before.
Yeah.
And I mean, it had this extraordinary, metaphor, which the Chinese, I noticed, like metaphors. So,
Yeah.
that if you put on your shirt, you want to have things correct, you have to start with the right button. The foundation has to be in the correct place. And that was, I thought, a very powerful metaphor, actually. And then there was a very strong words about Taiwan, saying that Taiwan for China is the first red line, which must never be crossed. And if it is, don't make the mistake of thinking that China will simply sit on its hands. So, I mean, it was stronger language from the Chinese that I've seen before. And I think it's partly a reflection that the Chinese feel themselves to be in a strong position now with the US, because the US is in so much trouble in so many places. But I think principally it's that the Chinese feel that their message is not getting across. Biden still comes along and lies to Xi Jinping. And I think Xi Jinping is not happy about it. Well, why would he be?
Yeah, and also Xi Jinping also in his statement also stated that this is not de-risking. The de-risking itself is creating risks, which I would say is he's right. And I also got the sense he almost like a little bit lose patience a little bit. It's like how much more clear can I be,
Yes. Well, that was exactly the sense I got, that he is starting to lose patience. And, Xi Jinping, and I get to say this, contrary to everything you read about him, in the Western media, he comes across to me as a very polite, very patient man, at least in his dealings with other foreign leaders. How he is with our people, with the officials in China, that I don't know. But in his conduct of diplomacy, he's very measured and careful in his choice of words, and always has been. And he's very, very, often very, very charming. I've seen him in action. He can be extremely charming, actually.
Yeah.
But I think he is losing patience. He understands how important the relationship with America is, as he points out, not just for China, but for the whole world. He's not seeking to make problems, but he's becoming very frustrated with the president, an administration that comes along and tells him one thing, and then the moment the phone is down, the Americans say to themselves, well, we've got another few weeks. We kept, lulled the Chinese quiet, so let's go on and deploy a few more missiles in Asia. I mean, it can't work like that. I mean, it simply isn't. They're trying to do to the Chinese what they did to the Russians in the run-up to the start of the military crisis in Ukraine. And as the Russians, in a much weaker position, they went along with it much more. I mean, they start with the Minsk agreement far beyond any point of good sense. Putin admits as much. But eventually they lost patience too. With China, this is a far more dangerous game.
And going back to Yellen's, there's some details kind of interesting just to share with you. One thing related to this overcapacity thing, Yellen specifically point to EVs and solar panels and batteries, lithium batteries. Okay. At the same time, one of the agenda, according to her, and also it's stated in the Treasury Department's website, is that she's talking about climate change. They always like to bring up climate change, but lots of the Chinese media are saying, well, you wanted to produce less EVs, solar panels, which these things are the things you told us are good for the environment. So how can that work? You want to fight climate change, and you wanted to reduce the production in those things that you said yourself are good for the environment. Explain
Well,
this.
yeah, I mean, I mean, the China, I didn't know that the Chinese are saying that, but of course they're right. I mean, it makes absolutely no sense at all. The Americans say, the Americans have been saying, they've been campaigning, the administration has been campaigning, the Europeans have been campaigning. We must transfer all automotive industries towards EVs. This is the overriding priority in order to save the climate. We have to have solar panels. We have to move away from fossil fuels. We have to do all of that. And the Chinese say, fine, this is what we're going to do too. And we're really good at it. We sort out our factories and get our production well organized. And we do it with incredible speed and with brilliant success. And my friends in Russia tell me that the Chinese cars are every bit as good as Western cars, if not sometimes better. And with EVs, they're streets ahead. And then the Americans suddenly turn around and say, no, this is quite wrong. It's unfair. You can't possibly do this. This is overcapacity.
Yeah.
It's a sign that your model is too successful, because that's what they're basically saying. And what one senses that deep down, again, what actually happened was that when the Americans started this whole narrative about EVs and things like that, they assumed that it would be the new technology in which they would be the leaders, and it would enable them to open another technological lead over other countries, including China. And then shock, horror, suddenly turned out otherwise, that the Chinese are ahead. And, they might be trying to stop the Dutch, providing maintenance to lithography machines, which is terrible, by the way. I mean,
Yeah.
Biden saying, you can't, we're not here to prevent your development. And then the Americans take a clear-cut, straightforward step to block China's development. So they're doing all of that. And of course, all that's going to happen, and much sooner than the Americans expect, is that the Chinese will make their own lithography machines, which are going to be better than the Dutch. Or, and I know that there are some people who think this, the Chinese will do something even more alarming for the Americans. They'll move into the next technology. And I've heard stories that the Chinese are well ahead of the Americans in photonics, for example, which is supposed, I should tell you, I'm no expert in these matters, but that this is the next step up in, computer technologies. I was reading only the other day in the Daily Telegraph, of all places, that the Chinese are now well advanced in the technology to make quantum computers, which are apparently a completely different technology from anything we've seen in computer science up to now, and that would enable the China, that would be the next huge leap forward, and that might happen. And of course, doing it in this way is incentivizing China to do it even faster, and it has the resources, it's got the scientists, it's got the engineers, it's got the mathematicians, it's got the raw materials to do all of these things, and it incentivizes them to do it, and to do it in a way which, instead of being done in partnership with Americans, as it might easily be, is going to be done in competition with them. But there we are.
And also regarding EV, the overcapacity, I really don't think Yellen can really say that, because Chinese EV is not even in the US market. So where do you get the data that is saying overcapacity? Now in Europe, they are very competitive with Chinese cars, but being competitive is not the same thing as overcapacity, right? That's not the same thing. So, and then this whole environment thing that in China, more and more people, I mean, a few years back, some people already saying, okay, this whole climate change is just made up to stop a developing country from developing. That's the whole purpose. Now, at the time, I didn't really buy into it, but even like 3 years back, there was a famous Chinese scientist. He even said that. He said, let's see the Western countries, how they curb the emission. They are not doing much. They are not going to meet their goals. Well, clearly, recently I read that the UK, the Germany, and the whole European Union pretty much said that they are going to miss their target for the zero emission. Okay, so this scientist predict that like 3 years ago. So this whole idea about climate change, everybody now is very skeptical because China is doing its part to do
Yeah.
this, and now get complained from the West, from the United States.
Well, that's right. When China continues to operate coal-powered fire stations, you complain about that. You say that this shows that China is, the great polluter. When China produces green technologies and EV cars and solar panels, well, this is overcapacity. Whatever China does, for the West, it cannot win. It's always somehow threatening. And it's a propaganda theme. And I agree, but by the way, I've long since come to that conclusion that the Western powers about climate change, that the Western powers have a wonderful capacity for doing whatever suits them at any particular point of time. And then when others follow, start doing the same thing. In other words, copying Western industrialization, copying Western agricultural reorganizations and things of that kind. Then they say, oh, no, you can't do that. It's absolutely wrong. You're hurting the wildlife. You're destroying the environment. You're upsetting the climate. Of course, the fact that we did all this, just a few years ago doesn't mean that you're allowed to do it now. And it's always about keeping the West technologically a step, or indeed even more than a step ahead of everyone else. It's become very much a mechanism of economic and social control over everyone else. And of course, you can do that. I mean, you can to some extent influence other countries to do this. You have enormous influence in countries like Brazil, India, even China. You cannot do this, and that's the fundamental problem.
And people are joking about Janet Yellen because she shows like she's eating in different places. So people are saying maybe the whole purpose of her trip, because she was in China just last July, not that long ago, and apparently even in December last year she was talking about coming back to China again, and China was like, why? We're busy here at the end of the year, etc. So they keep on delaying until Biden pick up the phone, kind of like, okay, she must have come or something. So Chinese people are saying, netizens are saying, maybe she just likes Chinese food.
Well, I have to tell you, I mean, I don't know whether this is true in the US or elsewhere, or in China, in fact, but I've been reading so many stories in the British media about her immense diplomatic skills, which she's achieved by learning how to use chopsticks. I mean, it's so strange. But maybe that's what she was doing. Maybe she was
Yeah.
practicing her chopsticks using skills all this time. I mean, but again, it shows a fundamental lack of seriousness in the conduct of diplomacy, and an inability to accept that other countries, other powers, have rights that are at least equal to those of the United States. And this isn't something that, as the Americans, or by the way, the many Europeans really understand or want to
Yeah.
accept.
And that's why I think the conclusion for her trip is even Bloomberg is saying that Chinese President Xi Jinping won't back down against the West. I mean, I wouldn't use the
Well,
word back down. I mean, I'm just
no,
saying Xi
no.
Jinping would just do
I,
whatever he thinks is right for China, right?
exactly. I mean, that very word, that very phrase gives the whole story away. I mean, you never talk about the Americans backing down. It's always the other side that has to back down. China's not going to back down because China isn't thinking about this. Again, look at the economic figures. Chinese industries dwarf those of America's. They're more advanced. They're more sophisticated. The economy is larger than that of the US. I mean, how can you talk about backing down? Obviously, if you want to conduct negotiations and diplomacy on a real basis, looking to achieve mutually acceptable solutions, then you meet the other side halfway, and you can sometimes make concessions, and that's part of negotiations. Every negotiation involves one side or the other making concessions, and usually both but backing down. It's like it's the kind of language that a bully uses in a schoolyard. You know, you punch around and you force people to back down in front of you. And China is never going to accept that. I mean, China has no reason to accept it, and its modern history tells it that it must never do that.
Yeah. And the timing of Lavrov coming, because when Lavrov landed in Beijing, Yellen hasn't left. Yellen's still there. And lots of netizens saying that it's not coincidence. That is by design. That is sending the message to the United States. We don't care what you're saying. You know, if you want to come, fine. We don't even care that. We have business to deal with. Okay, we have real business, real things to discuss with Lavrov. Is that what your interpretation?
Well, more importantly, and I'm very interested to hear that, because if that's a lot of people in Russia have been saying, and you know, one always has to worry, you know, when people say that in Russia, that, you know, there might be some element of, you know, wishful thinking, that, you know, that they want to believe that this is why the Chinese were happy to receive Lavrov at that time. But if people in China are saying it, it looks like it was true. I mean, again, putting aside the fact that I think China has many good reasons to value its relationship with Russia. Two big countries, enormous border, complementary economies. They've got, you know, it's in their joint interests to have good relations. But putting that entirely to one side, the very fact that the Americans are putting pressure on the Chinese to try to downgrade their relations with the Russians, I think would be enough reason for the Chinese to say, no, we're not going to do that. We want to have good relations with the Russians and to have Lavrov here. Because if the Chinese start making concessions about things like that to the Americans, about China's relations with third countries, then they know as night follows day that the Americans will come and they'll make more demands about other things. So I think that it was intended as a signal to the United States. Yeah, Yellen is in Beijing. She's meeting all these important people, but we can have Lavrov also coming to Beijing. We're going to continue business as usual with the Russians. He's going to have meetings with Wang Yi. And of course, he's also met Xi Jinping, and this clearly preparatory to a meeting with Putin next month.
Yeah, so that's what the Chinese media is saying, that the purpose of his visit is, of course, the timing kind of send a message, but also they do have a lot of important things to discuss. You know, the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation, and the G20, you know, etc. And then they talk about United Nations. Well, my guess is that when they say about United Nations, they were really talking about how to solve like a Gaza problem, those kind of
Yes.
thing, right? The whole Middle East thing in United
Abs-
Nations, right? These are the real discussions. They do have things to talk about, right?
They have an enormous amount of things to talk about. Of course, the Chinese and the Russians are, I am sure, in continuous contact with each other. I mean, the embassies of both countries are very active, of that I've no doubt. But also, I mean, I'm sure that there's lots of telephone calls and, you know, exchanges that we don't know about. But there is no substitute for face-to-face meetings between leaders. Wang Yi actually said that, you know, that guidance from leaders is really important. So there's no substitute for that. Putin is going to come with a very strong delegation of people. There will be all the things that you talked about: BRICS, the building of the BRICS, the development of the One Belt, One Road. The Russians are now talking about recalibrating the Eurasian Economic Union, which is their own grouping of economic states, that they're going to want to try to combine that in some way with the One Belt, One Road, that they want to recalibrate it around the One Belt, One Road initiative. So they'll be talking about that. They'll be talking about currencies. The RMB is now the most widely traded foreign currency in China, and is in Russia rather, and is the major currency now traded in Russian foreign exchange markets ahead of the US dollar. Just saying. So they'll want to talk about that. They'll want to talk about strategic cooperation. They'll want to talk about UN cooperation. And they will want to talk about industry to industry cooperation, which is very important. The Chinese the Russians want Chinese help to develop their car industry. This is an important factor because one of the big strategic mistakes the Russians made during the Putin era, by the way, was that they sought to develop their car industry using Western technology and investment, which is to a much greater extent than other parts of their industries, for example. And the result was that when the sanctions were imposed in 2022, the car industry suffered particularly hard. So they want to get their car industry back up and running again. And the obvious partner to do it is China. So they want that. They want cooperation in aerospace, in computers, where the Russians have things they can offer, because they're very strong mathematics and all of that. By the way, probably in lithography as well. It's fairly well known in Russia that Rosatom, the atomic nuclear energy conglomerate there, has been working hard in lithography for some time, and they may have achieved progress there. Lasers, for example, were some things where the Russians were pioneers back in the 50s and 60s. So just say, so they want to talk about all of these things, and of course, military cooperation, work of navies, balancing of navies, and they will want to talk about diplomacy, the state of the war in Ukraine, lots of things of that kind.
And one more thing. Also, the Chinese media noticed that in their readout they talk about the terrorist. So it's not that long ago, right? The Moscow concert hall, the terrorist attack, and around that time, the people didn't pay much attention, but there were 5 Chinese workers in Pakistan was attacked and killed, and so there's some effort to hurt the Belt and Road Initiative. Those workers are working in Pakistan for the Belt and Road Initiative. What's interesting is that it's also ISSK. It seems like they're the same group of people. Now, isn't that strange? ISIS, in the beginning, when they started, they were against the West. And now it seems like they just attacking somehow turned against all the adversaries of the United States. Isn't that strange?
Well,
they are people in China writing straightforwardly that the US is controlling the ISSK, isn't it?
Well, so many people in Russia, so many other people, not just in Russia and China, but around the world. I can remember when the original ISIS was set up in the, back in the day in 2014, 2015, I saw an opinion poll that came out of Iraq. Most people there at that time thought that ISIS was largely a creation of the USA. So, I don't know to what extent this is true, but it is undoubtedly the case that in recent years, ISIS seems to have a strange habit of picking targets which are adversaries of the United States. Even the Taliban in Afghanistan, for example, they went against. So, de facto, however it's working, however it's done, ISIS and the US seem to be on the same page about who their enemies are.
And I think that makes sense for China, Russia, and even Iran, but because people, shouldn't forget, even all these countries seems like need to be careful with the ISSK.
Oh, absolutely. Iran has been a major target and has had to suffer extensive terrorist activity from ISIS-K. So they are very concerned about ISIS-K. And again, if you ask Iranians, I have asked Iranians, they absolutely believe that ISIS-K is a tool of the USA. This is a very widespread view, and ISIS-K's behavior seems to provide some corroboration.
And Donald Trump, I think at one point even said that Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama created ISS. Okay, that lots of people think Donald Trump is crazy, but many times when he says something, there's some truth in it.
It's true enough. It's true enough. Well, who knows? He was president of the United States. He did get an awful lot of information, presumably then. I have to say, can I say something? Again, the origins of ISIS and ISIS-K have never been satisfactorily explained. But we have now extensive academic literature on American involvement in the Middle East, going back all the way to the 1940s. And it is a consistent story that the United States has backed um, um, dangerous, violent, ultra, secessionist in many cases groups, which tend to be focused around a certain form of Islamic fundamentalism.
Mhm.
So there is a long history of this, and ISIS fits beautifully into this story.
Mhm.
It might, we don't know the whole facts. It's probably quite complicated. There's probably been some disputes and arguments about it, but I mean, if it is an American creation, a pure American creation, it would not be unprecedented. It
Yeah,
would not actually be contrary to what has happened before.
yeah. Okay, Scholz is coming. I think
Mm,
this Sunday or Saturday or Sunday. He's
mm,
going to come with other ministers and a huge business delegation.
mm.
Does that mean that they are not going to decouple, de-risking the relationship with China? Is that how you read
Well,
it?
I hope so. I mean, I sincerely hope so. Germany has made one catastrophically bad political and economic decision after another ever since Angela Merkel stepped down as chancellor, and Scholz came in. I mean, he's been the chancellor of a terrible administration. And I think that what has finally happened is that the German business community, people at Daimler and Siemens, both of their CEOs apparently joining this delegation, have finally said to Scholz, look, enough damage has been done with these weird and wonderful green policies and this catastrophic breach of our relations with the Russians. We have to keep the relationship with China going because it's our one remaining lifeline. And I think Scholz has just finally perhaps grasped this. I remember that in the old days, Merkel used to come to Beijing with these very strong German business delegations. So it's something of a relief, actually, to see Scholz doing the same thing.
Well, about Merkel, I have this question, right? That Merkel is the one who asked Putin to build the Nord Stream 2, isn't it?
Mm,
It's not
true.
Putin's initiative. She's the
Yeah.
one. So she
Mm,
clearly understands that for Germany to thrive, the German industry to thrive, it's a good combination to have cheap natural resource from Russia and then access the Chinese huge market. That's a good
mm.
combination. So out of all the people in the world, how can she is the one not to try all her best to prevent this war in Ukraine? She must know this is hurting Germany. Why is she going along with all these not very sincere Minsk agreement, not to push Ukraine to implement that? Why doesn't she do more? I don't
This is
understand this.
the you put your finger on it. I think this is the great failure of Angela Merkel as a statesman, because you're absolutely right. She understood the realities. She understood that Germany's future was linked to cheap energy imports from not just cheap but reliable energy imports from Russia, and also access to the Chinese market and to a good, strong economic relationship with China. But she never took the step, she never acted to consolidate the politics around this. She always wanted at the same time to be on good terms with the Americans. She was never prepared to speak to the Americans in unequivocal terms and say to them, look, the relationship with Russia is for Germany an absolute economic national interest priority. She was never ready to do that to the German people as well. She'd never fought that corner with the German political class. And on relations with China, I'm afraid she did again, she avoided fighting for it in the same sort of way. And the result is that the political consensus which should have been there wasn't. Now, why did she take this position? I have to say, I think, and I've heard this many times from many people, including people who've known Merkel, that she was somebody who always avoided direct confrontations. She didn't want to get into rows with the Americans. She didn't want to get into rows with the Atlanticist group within Germany. She understood how strong American influence was within Germany. And these people have also told me that she very, very much liked being chancellor and didn't want to lose that position. And she didn't want to get into a situation where the Americans might start working with the Atlanticist factions within the German, her own party, the CDU, and within German society as a whole, and sought to undermine her. So it was an act of political cowardice in the end.
Mm.
Instead of showing the courage and the strength of will and the imagination to try to bring the Ukraine crisis under control, as was fully within her power through the Minsk agreement, instead of going out of her way to explain to the Germans why the relationship with Russia was essential in order to remain chancellor, she acted to preserve all of these things, but never took on the critics full on. And that's, by the way, the story of Merkel and everything else. It's why German political leadership is so weak at the moment, because she never fostered successors, because, again, she was always worried that if she did, they might turn into rivals. She was also never someone who really looked at the problems of the European Union and worked to solve them. She was somebody who had a very manipulative approach to policy altogether. And I'm afraid Germany is now paying the price.
Yeah, it's yeah, probably intimidation, I guess, to a certain degree, because United States is very good at intimidate different people, right?
Absolutely.
Obama famously was surveilling her through her phone, right?
Yeah,
That her
yeah,
phone was hacked. I mean, and she didn't say a word. She didn't, even
yeah.
like a protest, even a little bit, like as if it didn't happen. So I guess, but she must have feel like threatened a little bit when she knows that her phone is hacked and by the United States, with so much talking about Huawei this and Huawei that, China this and China that. In the end, whoever is hacking her phone is the United States. But I guess that's once she knows that, I mean, she probably take
Mm.
that as a signal that she just shouldn't be too much lining up with the Russians.
Well,
Probably.
this is exactly right. I mean, the other thing to say is that, and this again, I know from people, is that when you meet American officials and American diplomats, I mean, they are unbelievably aggressive and rude to a degree that is very difficult to imagine. I mean, the tone is extremely bullying. Unless you are a very strong personality and a very self-confident one, it's very easy to just take this. I mean, it's it's, and I'm afraid Angela Merkel and Germany generally never had that kind of self-confidence.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
never had the self-confidence to push back aggressively against the Americans in the way that they should have done.
Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately, I mean, yeah, I think you're totally right that because they're also in China, Chinese media, they're reporting how rude and the Americans towards the South Korean, towards the Japanese, that's
Yeah.
pretty much like a common practice.
Hmm.
It's like
Yeah.
it's not like uniquely towards
No.
German. It's just
No.
everywhere. They just like
Everywhere.
that.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, about the Ukraine. So is France really seriously going to put boots on the ground? Is this serious?
Well, I don't think France is. I
Okay.
think it is very much something that Emmanuel Macron, who is the president of France, wants to do.
But
And
why? Why does he want to do that?
yeah, well, this is the unknown and impossible question to answer, because it makes no sense and it contradicts his own policies. Uh, it's not a secret. He said it openly on a program that we recently did with him on the Duran. Professor Jeffrey Sachs says
Mhm.
that he finds it very bewildering because he spoken to President Macron in private, and Macron has said things in private to him which completely contradict, are completely different from the public positions he's taking. Now, I think that Macron, at some level, feels very angry with the Russians. He's very angry about what has happened in West Africa. Now, I have to say that makes absolutely no kind of sense to me. The French position in West Africa has certainly crumbled, but that's not because of the Russians. It's because of the West Africans. The West Africans have got tired of France. It's not because the Russians moved in. They don't have that influence there, nor did the Russians particularly interested until recently in West Africa. I mean, but anyway, apparently he feels very, very angry about that. Other members of the French establishment feel that too. He is very angry with the Germans. The Germans have been taking the lead in, supplying arms to Ukraine and in the diplomacy. And he says, that France, that we have this arrangement in Europe. The Germans take the lead on economic matters, and we take the lead on political and strategic matters. And so the Germans shouldn't be doing this. And I need to assert myself against the Germans in some ways. So he wants to go a bit further and above and beyond all of that. But he also feels, I think, very angry with the Russians. And this is more difficult to understand, quite apart from the West Africa thing, which is, I think, that he overestimated his diplomatic skills. For a very long time, believed that he was the person who was going to win the Russians over to the European way of thinking. I remember this when Putin first visited Paris just after Macron had become president. Macron had prepared this long lecture and a sense of, exhibitions and things, trying to make Putin understand why, accepting European leadership was what Russia's interests were. He talked about Peter the Great and lectured Putin on Russian history, which Putin was. I follow Putin. He was very angry about, actually. He didn't like being lectured in that way. Mm-hmm. But anyway, I think Macron had this strange idea that, he spoke to the Russians in some ways, won them over in some ways. He would be able to persuade the Russians to act as a kind of auxiliary for the Europeans. And he was apparently trying to get the Russians, before the war began, to drop the Minsk agreement, to accept, to hand over Donbass and all of that, come to some kind of direct terms with the Ukrainians. And he seems to have thought that he could do this. And of course, none of that was real. None of that worked. And I think he feels very, very angry about it. So he wants to put the Russians in their place. He wants to humiliate the Russians because of West Africa. He wants to show to the Germans that he's strong. He wants to show the Americans that France still is an active country and can take a lead on things where even the Americans are weak. And I mean, I think a lot of it ultimately is connected to his own vanity. He also has a difficult political situation in France. There are European elections coming. All the indications are that his party is going to do extremely badly, and that Marine Le Pen's party is going to win a big majority in those European elections. And again, I think partly his strategy might be, or so he thinks, take a hard line against the Russians and then paint Le Pen as the pro-Russian candidate who's not really patriotic about France. Now, he has profoundly miscalculated the mood amongst his own people. I mean, the French people do not want to get drawn into this conflict in Ukraine. But, that's something which Macron probably doesn't take much notice of.
But doesn't that make him, if he keep on talking like this, it could make him dangerous, right? He could push himself into the corner if he keep on this tough talk, and then in the end he doesn't really dare to do it and make him look weak and stupid. Doesn't make him kind of dangerous in a way if he keep on this kind of a rhetoric.
It is incredibly dangerous. It is utterly reckless. I mean,
Yes.
one of two things could happen. I mean, if he executes on this thing, French troops go to Ukraine. The
Mhm.
Russians have made it absolutely clear that if they go to Ukraine, they're targets. The Russians attack them. The French are in no position to take on the Russians militarily. Nobody is in any doubt about this. Uh, so one of two things will happen. Either France suffers heavy losses, they have to pull out of Ukraine, Macron is humiliated, or alternatively, the French suffer heavy losses and they turn to the Americans for help. Now, Macron is telling the Americans, don't worry, I'm never going to do that.
Mhm.
But I don't think it's safe to believe him about this. I think that is exactly what he will do. And then, of course, the question is, what do the Americans do in that kind of situation? Do they go into Ukraine themselves to rescue the French? In which case, we're in a World War III
Yeah.
potentially situation. Or do they abandon Macron to his fate,
Mhm.
which could have a very bad effect on America's position in Europe? So it is an incredibly reckless, very dangerous game. And it's amazing again that the Americans aren't going out of their way and stamping their foot and telling Macron, you will not do this under any circumstances.
And the other thing, also Ukraine recently attacked the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which I also
Mm.
think is very reckless because they have tried a few times, right? I mean, every time that Russia managed to protect it, but if they keep on doing this, something can go very wrong if it start a leak, stuff like that. And that is
Ah,
another escalation, isn't it?
it absolutely is. And again, it's a crazy thing to do. And one wonders why they persist in doing this because I mean it seems to me absolutely irrational that they would go on behaving in this way, but they are. And here I have to say this, I do wonder whether this is partly intended as a signal towards China, because China
Yes.
has repeatedly said attacks on nuclear power stations are absolutely unacceptable. And here we have Ukraine going on doing it. And it could be that the Ukrainians are basically saying to the Chinese, look, if you don't help us, we're going to do something utterly crazy and utterly reckless, which is blow up a nuclear power station. And they could be essentially saying the same to the Americans and the Europeans also.
To help, but China sent an envoy to Ukraine, trying to talk
Mm,
into some senses to them, sit
mm,
down, talk, and get over with this whole thing. It's not you're not winning. You're not going to win. But that doesn't
mm.
seem register with Ukraine. Instead, they just keep on doing these kind of things, making it more and more dangerous, it seems to me, that they know they're not going to win. So they're doing these kind of terrorist things, isn't it?
Oh, that's exactly correct. I mean, I again, it's not always easy to understand. In fact, it's not easy is at all to understand what kind of thinking is going on in Ukraine at the moment, because
Mhm.
they're losing. I mean, I don't think anybody now is under any doubt that the Ukrainians are losing the war and losing it very badly. Um, um, but they don't want to negotiate. They're demanding that the Americans and the Europeans send them unlimited supplies of weapons, more weapons than, in some cases, than the Americans and the Europeans have. Um, they show no concern for the general strategic interests of their Western allies or for their resources. I mean, they have a massive sense of entitlement. And whenever anybody comes along and says to them, look, you're losing the war, you can't win
Mhm.
the war in your own interests, in the world's interest, you must sit down and talk with the Russians. They're just incredibly rude, as Li Hui found out recently. And it's very difficult to understand. Um, but they are behaving like the spoilt child that has been indulged for far too long and which now believes that it has a right to whatever it wants.
Yeah, talking about the spoiled child. Okay, so is Middle East.
Mm,
Israel pulled most of the troops from Gaza, from the
mm,
South Gaza.
mm,
But Netanyahu, another spoiled child, said he
mm,
already set a date for aggression or invasion of Rafah, even though
mm,
everybody think it's crazy.
mm,
Um, in the meantime, we don't know what Iran's going to do in terms of the response to the Israel bombing its embassy. So that's another very dangerous situation, isn't it? Another
it's
spoiled
incredible.
child.
It's another spot bound. It's an incredibly dangerous situation. Even the Americans are telling them, don't do this now. This isn't going to work. The war in Gaza has been a complete debacle. I mean, they went in, they were going to destroy Hamas. They haven't destroyed Hamas. They've had to pull most of their troops out. Their economy has suffered terribly. They've been isolated globally. And yet, instead of taking a step back, thinking about what's going wrong, trying to find a way back from this disaster, talking to countries, again, like China, which might be prepared to help. The Chinese have shown great willingness to talk to the Israelis. The Israelis come back. Now we're going to start another battle in Rafah this time. And, no reason to think that's going to make things any better. In fact, it's going to make things worse. But that's what we're going to do, even because the world wants us to do it, not to do it. We're going to do it.
Yeah, yes. And nobody's talking about how this can be dangerous because Netanyahu, I mean, there's a lot of talking about Putin is crazy, but Netanyahu also has nuclear weapons. Nobody talking about that. If he truly feel he's cornered, because domestically he's not doing well either. But domestically, what's interesting is I saw his Justice Department, the head of the Justice Department, the Ministry of Justice. He actually said if Netanyahu does not go into Rafah, then he shouldn't have any credibility to continue to be the prime minister. So it seems like there are people on the right, on the far right, to pressure him as well. And of course, the rest of the world are just saying, this is crazy. You cannot do that. You cannot do that. In the meantime, there is a humanitarian crisis going on in the whole Gaza, in the Rafah, that area. So it seems like, and he's not winning in terms of the war against Hamas, etc. So if he really think he is cornered, isn't there is a possibility that he's going to do something extreme, including use nuclear weapons? Isn't that nobody's talking about that?
No, nobody's talking about that, but you're absolutely right. And what I have seen, a report which I saw this morning, which left me very concerned, is that apparently he's now seriously contemplating, and the Israelis are preparing for airstrikes against Iranian nuclear sites. It's exactly the kind of thing, in other words, that could very easily lead us to that position which you've just spoken about. And again, you would have thought that people in Europe and people in the United States would be taking steps to bring this whole situation under the control. And of course, they're not doing it.
It's pretty incredible. I think right now there's so many dangerous situations where the U.S. leadership would be coming handy. This is a place and time that U.S. show the world that I'm the one who can get things in order, who can calm down everybody. But the U.S. is not doing that. It just keep on selling weapons to Israel, for example, right? Still trying to get money to Ukraine to continue to fight. It does not have intention to slow down and get everybody calm down at all, even though on the surface saying, oh, we want to see this and that, but they're not doing that.
No, they're not doing that. I mean, a good example, not going swiveling back to Ukraine. I mean, the Ukrainians have been carrying out attacks on Russian oil refineries. The United States says, we don't want you to do that. Must stop doing that, Ukraine. Lloyd Austin has come out and said, all it might do is increase the price of oil, which we don't want to see. So Ukraine just goes on doing it. So what does the United States do? Does it say, no, in that case, we can't continue to help you with weapons, money, because you're disregarding our interests? Oh, no, it wants to give them another $60 billion. And with Gaza, the same. They said to the Israelis, look, we want a ceasefire there. We want an immediate ceasefire. We must have an immediate ceasefire there. But we also want to give you more F-15s and more bombs and more things of that kind. And this, again, is America unable to control its own proxies, so that instead of American policy being made in Washington exclusively, it is made increasingly in Kiev and Tel Aviv. And that is a very dangerous thing in itself, and one which one assume Americans would be bothered about, but which surprisingly many of them are not.
Yeah, and the UN Human Rights Council also voted in favor of a resolution to stop selling and shipping weapons to Israel. But
Yeah,
I just read that David Cameron, the UK foreign minister, he actually said that they are not going to block arms sales to Israel.
yeah.
So they just totally, the Britain is just totally ignore this Human Rights Council's resolution.
Well, that's right. Absolutely correct. They have, yes. They've ignored the resolution. They're going to reject if the International Court of Justice uh, says that Israel is committing a genocide or looks like it's committing a genocide. They're going to ignore that as well. They insist that China must, perform every single ruling that the ICJ makes. But if Israel commits genocide, contrary to a decision of the International Court of Justice, well, that's fine. You're not bothered. I mean, it's unbelievably dangerous to indulge spoiled children in that way. Children that, are happy to smash up all the toys in the playroom if they don't get their way. And of course, we're not really talking about toys. We're talking about, countries and nuclear power stations in the case of one, nuclear weapons in the case of the other. We're talking about very, very dangerous situations. But instead of coming along, saying to the Israelis and to the Ukrainians, look, we could prepare to do this for you, but we're not going to go that. We're not going to, under any circumstances, agree to that. You must accept our guidance. Biden gave the Ukrainians a blank check, and he's done the same with the Israelis. He gave them both. He basically said, we will support you as long as it takes. And of course, when you do that, you lose control.
Okay. Something else about this Unit 731, the Japanese human experiment thing. The reason I want to bring it up is Oppenheimer, the movie, premiered in Japan, which you can imagine is a huge controversial in Japan. And the Japanese was even saying that Oppenheimer himself, contributed partially to the two nuclear bombs dropped in Japan. But there is no discussion in Japan about why. Why did US did that, right? And so some people brought up, like, among other things, what you did, like Unit 731, which is extremely, I mean, you push all the human limits, all right, that's what you did. And so there's a lot of search word for why it was very, it was among the most searched terms, the Unit 731. And of course, Japan is not happy. My question is, I always wondered, why isn't the US doing more to explain to the world why they dropped those two bombs? The atrocities that Japan did, not just the Unit 731, the rape of Nanking, and then a whole bunch of other things they did in other countries in South Korea, the comfort woman, all these kind of awful, awful things. But it seems like the US doesn't really want people to know the stories behind those two nuclear bombs. Why is that?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't want to discuss anything about that. It doesn't want to talk about Japan's dark history, the terrible things that happened. It doesn't want to talk about Japan's war with China. Period. I mean, most Americans don't know that it even happened. As far as most Americans are concerned, Japan one fine morning decided to attack Pearl Harbor. It came out of nowhere. And that was it. And there was nothing else. Nothing else happened before. There wasn't a series of aggressions against Korea and China going back to the 1890s. There weren't attempts to conquer the rest of Asia. There weren't acts of unbelievable, unspeakable cruelty by the Japanese during that time. This whole period of history in America does not exist because the United States sees Japan as a strategic asset against China. That's what it's always been about. And it started to think of Japan in that way back in the 1940s. And they took steps to ensure that the emperor, who was deeply implicated in all of these things, was protected. And they took steps to ensure that the entire Japanese political and military class that had been heavily involved in all of these things were protected as well. So there has never been a proper accounting in Japan itself for any of these things, and no real explanation, as you said, of why the nuclear bombs fell. Even that in Japan is barely ever discussed, by the way. I mean, what happened, that there was a Japanese war of aggression. That's very little spoken about in Japan. And the result is that all of this is taken out of context, and these terrible experiments that the Japanese committed against the Chinese people, they're never talked about either. And they were, as you rightly said, only one atrocity amongst a great many. Now, I have never been to Japan, but once, about 30, 40 years ago, I used to work a lot for Japanese companies. And I came to know people, including Japanese soldiers, who had actually fought in China. And I can say this, and I want Chinese people to know this. These people, many of whom were Buddhists, felt terrible sense of guilt about this. They were tormented by it, and they felt extremely betrayed by what had happened, what Japan had done, by Japan's refusal to recognize what had happened. In fact, it was one of the reasons, by the way, why they weren't happy to live in Japan anymore, even though they were deeply patriotic Japanese people. The point I'm trying to make is that had things been approached by the United States in a different way in the 1940s and 1950s, there would have been many, many people in Japan who would have been willing to recognize and admit to what Japan had done at that time, because they felt a sense of guilt over it. But that didn't happen because, again, the United States, playing its geopolitical games, sided with the worst people in Japan, and basically ignored what the best people in Japan, who did exist at that time, wanted. Now, of course, it's too late. All those people have died. The people who are in Japan today, they don't know anything. They are brought up on a false history of what happened. They generally believe the legends that they're being told in Japan, that, Japan was trying to fight some great anti-imperialist war, and that it was all Japan was the victim in the Second World War, not the perpetrator. And the result is that the Chinese people are faced with the reality of the Japan we have now.
But when they do that, it's actually make United States look bad. Like for no apparent reason, you just dropped 2 atomic bomb. I mean, that seems like very excessive, right? For whatever Japan did, without coming to go into the details. And from Japan's viewpoint, I mean, to this day, if you ask just about anybody in Asia, who do they really afraid between Japan and China? I would say most people still trust China way more than they trust Japan, because Japan never apologized. There is no sincere apology, right? They never recognized what they did during World War II, and they never said that was wrong, and we're not going to do that again. They never did that. It only hurt Japan's own reputation, isn't it?
This is absolutely completely true. And by the way, again, because of course in London, you come across many people from Indonesia, the Philippines, and I want talks with people like that, and of course they remember all this. So Korea, I have a lot of contacts with Korea. My brother-in-law is married to a Korean woman, so I know about. I mean, I have visited Korea, and I have seen how Korean people feel about Japan and how they feel about China. And there is a huge difference, just as you say. I mean, they're much, much more antagonistic to Japan for understandable and obvious reasons than they're not antagonistic to China. At least they weren't when I was there. So there is this huge difference, and of course it's very bad for Japan itself, because as Japan has never itself acknowledged what it did, the terrible things that it did. There is no reason to trust it.
Okay. A little bit light about sports. Okay. The Olympic.
Mm.
Now, Olympic has become very political, isn't it? The next Olympic is going to be in Paris, and then first they said that the Russian athlete cannot go, and the Belarus athlete cannot go, and now they're saying they can go, but then they have to be almost like a pass through some kind of a examination to make sure they are political correct or something. But
Mm.
then the funny thing is that I just read that the triathlon the swimming part, they might have to cancel it because the water is so dirty in Paris. We were talking about the team, so it's so dirty, and that seems like the same problem. Why don't they, instead of putting boots on the ground in Ukraine, all that kind of thing, why don't they spend some time to clean up their own water?
I so completely agree with you. I mean, once upon a time, by the way, I mean, you used to drink French water in London. We had Perrier water and all of those things. Nobody does that anymore, by the way. I mean, Evian and all of that. I mean, you're absolutely right. This is a good opportunity to France to sort out its problems,
Mhm.
clean up the water, show a good face to the world. And instead, what we have, I mean, we've had this from Macron again, Russians are working to undermine the Olympics. How are the Russians working to undermine the Olympics? We want to send troops to Odessa, to all of these things. Exactly, by the way, when the Olympics would be taking place, because that's roughly the time they would arrive. And horrible things about trying to exclude Russian and Belarusian athletes and then putting them through all sorts of tests and then refusing to let them parade under their own flag. All outrageous and very disturbing things. Anyway, all of that, but you're absolutely right. The Olympic Games should be there to bring people of all countries together. It should be about bringing young people of all countries together, competing peacefully with each other, getting to know each other, being friends, all of these things. And Macron and the leadership of France don't seem to understand this huge opportunity they have and the possibilities it presents. And they're just getting it completely and hopelessly and disastrously wrong. But there it is.
And it just seems like all these, like a Nobel Prize and the International Court of Justice, Human Rights Council, all these things that I think more or less set up by the West, and the West is
Mm.
now actively undermining all of them. Is that what they're doing?
Absolutely. That's exactly what they're doing because, of course, what they want to do is to own them. Now, I ought to say, once upon a, this is the Olympics is a sensitive topic for me personally because though I'm not a sportsman in any shape or form, my grandfather and my great grandfather, amazingly, was there at the start of the Olympics in Athens in the 1890s. He eventually became mayor of Athens.
Okay.
But before he became mayor of Athens, there was the Olympic Games. He got to know Baron de Coubertin, who was the founder of the modern Olympics. If you go to the Olympic Village in Athens, the one that was built in the 1890s, you see his statues there. So all
Oh.
of that. So I have all of those, historic
Mhm.
connections with the Olympics. I used to hear stories about Baron de Coubertin, the kind of man he was, and he was a funny,
Mhm.
strange person. But he absolutely believed that the Olympics should be a global thing. People from all over the world should be included. They should compete with each other on equal terms. It was all about securing and establishing peace and friendship between nations. Now, of course, his point, I would also say that I was a European aristocrat, very much embedded in European culture. He, of course, had the ability to think conceptually beyond that. The people who lead things in the West today, they have none of his vision and imagination. And what they see is the Olympic Games. Well, the West used to run it, the West still should run it. So let's keep it under our control. Let's keep these horrible people from Russia away. Let's, be as rude as we can about the Chinese athletes who participate, which they are, by the way. If you read the newspapers here, the things they say about Chinese athletes are not really very nice, to put it mildly. All of those things. And we don't want them competing, or if they do compete, well, the odd African can win the odd gold medal and we can cheer them on and say how well they're doing. But they mustn't in any way undermine our dominance and control of the Olympic Games. We even time the events in the Olympics so as to make it most accessible to American TV viewers on the east and west coasts.
Yeah.
We do all of that. So this is what it's all about now. And you're absolutely right. They undermine all of these things because instead of them being really international, global institutions, serving the interests of the entirety of humanity, they end up simply becoming the toys of a small Western elite.
So their approach is either I own these organizations, so they do what I say, or I'll just destroy them. Okay.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
All right.
Correct.
Yeah. With that, let's just conclude here. Thank you again. Another busy week. I'm sure next week
Very
will
busy
be
week.
another busy week. We will talk
But a
again.
very historic
Yeah.
historic week. And as I said, let's not forget what the point I made at the start of the program. China, Beijing is now the capital of global diplomacy, much more than Washington, much more than Moscow. This is a revolution in global affairs. When the Chinese last year presented a peace, not peace plan, but peace proposals, ideas for settling the conflict in Ukraine, that was also a revolution. And now we see that revolution in global affairs is accelerating. The world has become bigger, and
Yeah.
China is at its center.
And that's part of the reason the US, at the same time want China's help, but then also hate it, and they have to threaten China, irritates, provoke China. I guess that explains its irrational behavior, I guess.
It absolutely does. This is, by the way, just going to say one quick thing. It's one thing that the Russians, despite the fact that the Russians have their roots in Europe, are different. Maybe because their country is so big, maybe because they border China and other Asian states. They don't have this complex that everything should revolve around the West. I mean, they've always accepted, even when they were part of Europe, that, there was a wider world beyond that. What is called Eurasianism in Russia, which is not really Eurasianism, is basically accepting that there is another world and other cultures and other civilizations and other ways of doing things, has very deep roots there, going way back into the 19th century. And it has no analogy anywhere else in any European country.
I think Russia in general is more realistic. I mean, they might have their view on, Russian should be this and it should be that, but if it doesn't work, it doesn't work, right? They try a different approach, and but right now, I think United States, it's almost like living in another world, in a fantasy world. Like they do things that doesn't make any sense, that
they are far more realistic. They have a full understanding of the limits of their own power. And one of the most interesting things is that, they see the rise of China and they're not frightened of it. They say, there's a chance, an opportunity. We're their neighbor. Let's find a way forward and see how we can benefit from this. It's a very, very practical point of view.
Yeah, and the US is panicking. US approach is not, accepting this is what it is. Let's see what we can benefit from it, right? Xi Jinping actually said that the rise of China presents opportunities, we can be win-win, all sort of thing. That the US just blatantly refused to accept that. That's so unfortunate. Yeah.
It is a tragedy. It is a tragedy, and a tragedy that always is there on the brink of becoming a disaster. Let's hope that disaster is avoided.
Let's hope. Yeah, we'll see. Okay. See you next week. Thank you again.
See you next week. Have a great week, Sophia. See you next week.
You too. Bye.
Bye.